everyone. So we are back for our week 3 Read Aloud. So last week we talked a lot about the idea of school segregation and we're introduced to the Little Rock Nine. Today we are going to pick up back in our book, The Civil Rights Movement. We're going to start by turning to page 16. So on page 16, I see this column here that even though it doesn't look like it's part of our narrative story, this inset does look like it's going to have important information for me to build my background knowledge about the civil rights movement. So it says, today's perspective. So I'm going to make a prediction, and that's probably going to help me build a connection from the civil rights movement to our lives today. So I'm going to pick up there. Today's perspective. Many people are still fighting for school integration. In some cities, African Americans and other minorities are isolated in certain neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods may have few resources to improve schools. Some cities are trying to solve this problem by redrawing the boundary lines that determine which schools students in different neighborhoods attend. By doing this, they hope to achieve more diversity, or a better mix of students from different backgrounds at each school. So I'm going to pause where I see the word diversity. I see here that they've included a definition for me right next to that word, offset by a comma. So I now know that diversity means a better mix of students from different backgrounds. This doesn't always mean that diversity has to do with students. Diversity has to do with having a mix of people with different backgrounds. So Houston is the most diverse city in America, which means that we live in a city where we have the most backgrounds represented. We have the best mix of people. I'm going to pick back up in 2007. In 2007, the Supreme Court blocked 2 cities' plans for this kind of integration. The judges argued that they are not against integration, but that the plans would not work as well as hoped. Debate about the court's decision continues to this day. So now I'm picking back up in my historical narrative on the civil rights movement. So I'm going to rewind back to the past to put myself in that mindset. This is all information about a past event. A seat on the bus. On December 1st, 1955, an African American named Rosa Parks took a seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Buses in Montgomery, as elsewhere in the South, were segregated. Seats in the front were reserved for white passengers. African Americans were to sit in the back. If the bus was crowded, African American passengers were required to give up their seats to whites. The bus Parks was on was crowded. When the bus driver asked her to move so a white passenger could sit, Parks politely refused. It was her right, she claimed, as a paying passenger. The police were called and Parks was arrested. So looking up at the top, I see this photograph. It's a historical photograph, and I'm gonna look at the caption to see what's happening. The caption in the photograph says, Rosa Parks became a symbol of the civil rights movement when she refused to give up her bus seat. So I know that that person inside the photo is probably Rosa Parks. I'm going to start back at my main narrative. The NAACP and other organizations promptly came to support Parks. NAACP lawyers fought her case. Meanwhile, a brief boycott of the bus service was planned. Buses and other forms of public transportation would not be used for one day. This would demonstrate the importance of the African American community to the public transportation system. On December 5th, approximately 40,000 African American bus riders living in Montgomery boycotted the system. Buses drove around all day, nearly or completely empty. Now I'm on page 18. At the top photograph, I see lots of people on a sidewalk, and the caption says, "During the Montgomery Bus Boycott, people walk to work." The boycott showed that peaceful protest could be effective. So, in this photograph, I see that we're demonstrating lots of people walking to work instead of choosing to take the bus system. So from this photo, I can see that boycotts are most successful when lots of people are coming together to show unity for an idea. The boycott expands. Seeing the success of the boycott encouraged the African American community to take further action. A much longer bus boycott was planned. To organize it, the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, was created. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was placed in charge. The 26-year-old King was a strong believer in peaceful protest of unjust laws. With the aid of Montgomery activist Joanne Robinson and the Women's Political Council, King put his ideas into practice with a boycott. The MIA asked for 3 changes in the Montgomery public transportation system. The first was better treatment of African American passengers. The second was that seating should no longer be based on skin color. And the third was to have Black bus drivers service routes that ran through African American neighborhoods. I'm going to take a pause here and look at this entry at the top to see what other background knowledge I can continue to build, especially since it might be important for the upcoming paragraph. This says, a first-hand look at Dr. King and Henry David Thoreau. I'm already familiar with Dr. King, and just for some background knowledge, Henry David Thoreau was an important author. I think that this excerpt might tell us something else about that. The essay Civil Disobedience was written by poet and philosopher Henry David Thoreau in 1849. So nearly 100 years before Dr. King was working in the civil rights movement. So remember, the Civil War was more than 100 years before the civil rights movement. So we are no longer having a conversation about slavery and whether slavery is legal or ethical, but we've said no, slavery is now illegal. And 100 years later, we see that African Americans are still being treated in unfair and unjust ways. There are still laws that treat them differently, even though they are supposed to have the same rights as all other Americans. I'm going to pick back up in my excerpt. Thoreau argued that citizens should protest a government whose laws are unjust. Such protests should be civil or nonviolent. One of Thoreau's primary examples was slavery, which he strongly opposed. See page 60 for a link to view the complete contents of Thoreau's essay. So if I look to page 60, I'm going to see that they've included all of these resources specifically that are for online learning. So if you're interested more in these old essays all about the idea of civil disobedience that Thoreau came up with and wrote about, this would be a great resource for you. I'm going to pick back up in my second sentence on page 19. African Americans would not ride public buses until these 3 demands were met. For 381 days, African Americans carpooled, rode bikes, or walked to and from work. The bus companies and downtown businesses suffered. The KKK, the police, and politicians tried to stop the boycott with threats, arrest, and violence. King's house was bombed. The boycott, however, continued. Finally, on December 20th, 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation on public buses was illegal. With this victory behind him, King and other Southern ministers formed a new organization. In January 1957, they officially created the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, with King as president. The SCLC would organize more peaceful protests, using them to inspire change across the country.